So what we're going to try to do today
Yeah.
is figure out the strategies that societies actually use to deal with ethnic diversity within a democracy. The classic idea of democracy, it assumes everyone's pretty much the same.
Yeah, there's this assumption of homogeneity. Doesn't really reflect the real world for most places, though.
Exactly. It's a big gap between the theory and what actually happens. How democracies manage to function or sometimes don't when you've got societies with diverse ethnic groups.
Right. Sometimes the goal is to actually reduce how ethnically diverse a place is.
So tell me more about this eliminating differences thing. How can that be done ethically?
One way is to just split things up. Partition, or secession they call it, Israel and Palestine, or when Czechoslovakia became the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The idea is each group gets to decide its own thing, self-determination.
You redraw borders based on ethnicity, but who gets to decide where those lines go? What about people who end up on the wrong side of the new border?
Huge potential for things to go bad. And think about Chechnya in the old USSR. Tried to make ethnically pure areas, ended up disastrous.
So redrawing maps is one way. What are some other ways to eliminate those differences?
Integration or assimilation is another one. Probably sounds familiar to a lot of people.
It does, but people use those words interchangeably. What's the real difference?
Integration is more about being able to function in a society. Work, vote, follow the rules, that kind of stuff. Doesn't mean giving up your whole culture.
Okay.
Assimilation, that's a deeper level. You adopt the language, customs, values, even might change your name to fit in.
One's about coexisting, the other's about blending in completely.
And here's a subtle point they made. Even integration, if you push it too hard, it can start to look like assimilation. If everyone's expected to speak the same language, do things the same way, fit into this narrow box, you've basically created assimilation, even if you don't call it that. That's the challenge, right?
Yeah.
Having that sense of belonging, being part of something bigger, but still letting all those unique cultures shine through.
It's a spectrum. You got to make sure unity doesn't kill diversity.
Assimilation, there's this old model, Milton Gordon's 7 stages.
7 stages.
Yeah, it starts with economics, then eventually you're intermarrying, everyone's the same. Nowadays, most academics think it's way more complicated than that.
So assimilation as an idea has gotten more complex over time.
There's voluntary assimilation, people choosing to adopt stuff from the dominant culture, and then there's the forced kind, which is all about control and denying people their rights.
Huge difference. Forced assimilation, that's a dark part of history for a lot of places. Forcing people to conform, wiping out their cultures, it's not something you just forget. No one's saying people shouldn't be able to change if they want to, but when the government's the one forcing it, that's when you gotta worry. We've talked about getting rid of differences, but what about approaches that say, hey, diversity is good, let's work with it?
Less democratic way first. Hegemonic control. One group runs the show, even if they're not the majority.
Oh, okay.
Saddam in Iraq, Sunnis over Shias, Assad in Syria, Alawites in charge.
So not wiping out the other groups, but one group's definitely calling the shots.
Many say it looks stable for a bit, but creates problems down the line. Then there's this thing called ethnic democracy.
Ethnic democracy sounds contradictory.
It is a mixed bag. You've got voting, all that, but the rules favor one group right from the start. Laws, even the Constitution, are tilted in their favor.
So it looks like democracy, but one group's always going to come out on top. Clever, but not exactly fair, huh? What about the genuinely democratic approaches, the ones that actually try to level the playing field?
One that gets talked about a lot is federalism. U.S. is the classic example. Central government sharing power with the states. Switzerland, with their cantons, it's super decentralized.
So it's not just splitting into regions, it's about figuring out who has the power, where.
And does it work? Depends how well those lines you draw match up with the cultural and ethnic lines that are already there.
Drawing the right lines is super important. What about when you can't really separate groups neatly, they're all mixed up together? What then?
That's when you look at something called Consociationalism, made for places where drawing lines just won't work. Lebanon, Northern Ireland, places like that. Basically, it's all about sharing power, but in a very specific way. Not just everyone gets a voice, it's about making sure no one group can just steamroll everyone else. Built-in compromise, you could say.
Consociationalism sounds idealistic. How do you actually design a system like that?
First, you got to have proportional representation. Each group gets seats based on how many people they are in the whole population. Then there's this thing called a power-sharing executive. The top jobs, they're split up between the different groups.
So the president's from one group, the vice president's from another, that kind of thing.
Keeps things balanced. And get this, there's minority vetoes too.
Vetoes. So a smaller group could block something even if everyone else wants it.
Yep. If they think it'll hurt them, they can stop it. That way, no one feels like they're being ignored.
Interesting. Instead of coming together, they're focused on what makes them different.
Exactly. It actually makes the ethnic divides worse because now they're official, part of the system. And instead of thinking about the whole country, they might just focus on what their group gets. Not great for national unity. Another one is that it can turn into a bunch of backroom deals. The leaders of each group making decisions without anyone else knowing.
So less transparent, less accountable. A trade-off then. You might avoid big fights, but maybe at the expense of real democracy. What are the crucial things that determine if democracy can actually work when you've got all this diversity?
One big one is where people live. Territorial concentration, it's called. Like with federalism, it works best if groups are clustered together.
So you can draw those state lines or whatever, and it makes sense. Like Quebec and Canada, they're mostly French-speaking, have their own thing going on.
Exactly. But when you've got groups all mixed up, like in Northern Ireland, or spread out over a huge area like indigenous communities in North America, federalism gets way harder.
Location matters. What else is key?
How many people are in each group, and how's that changing? Demographic stability, that's another big one. Big shifts, like lots of migration or one group having way more kids, that can throw things out of whack.
Yeah, it makes sense. In Lebanon, Christians shrinking, Shia growing, that's had huge effects on their politics. More people means more competition for resources and power.
And it's not just the numbers themselves, it's how people feel about it. If a group thinks they're losing ground, they might get more demanding, even aggressive, to protect what they see as theirs.
Fear leads to instability, which leads to more fear. Is there any way to design a system that can adapt to those changes instead of just breaking under pressure?
That's where those proportional things we talked about come in. Representation, power sharing, they can flex a bit as things change. Got to be able to roll with the punches, not try to stay frozen in time. And, of course, the bigger picture matters too. How willing the dominant group is to share and be fair, that makes a huge difference. When the people in charge feel threatened, they get defensive, resist change. Recipe for disaster.
So it's a mindset thing, not just numbers. If the majority sees diversity as a threat, they're going to clamp down, and that just breeds resentment and conflict. If they see it as a good thing, they're more likely to make a system that actually includes everyone.
Spot on. That feeling of security, of being okay with sharing, that can come from history, from culture, from a strong sense of national unity, all sorts of things.
Got to have a culture where compromise and cooperation are seen as strengths, not weaknesses. Which brings us to another fascinating factor that influences how well a diverse society does. It's like you're building trust, but on a massive scale. If groups have worked together before, found common ground, tackled problems as a team, that makes those little disagreements easier to handle.
Absolutely. That history of collaboration, even if it's on small stuff, it builds a foundation. You start to see that even with differences, you can still achieve things together.
So it's about creating a system that values working together and sees all those different cultures as assets, not obstacles.
Right. And that leads to maybe the most interesting part of this whole thing, cross-cutting cleavages. Imagine a society divided by religion and language. You might have French-speaking Protestants siding with German-speaking Protestants because their faith matters more than their language. Or secular folks from different backgrounds, they team up because they both want a secular government. Those are cross-cutting cleavages, different parts of people's identity overlapping, making things more complex.
So instead of these big, solid blocks clashing, you get a society where everyone's identity is woven together, more like a tapestry with different threads making a stronger whole.
Perfect analogy.
How do those cleavages play out in a place where it feels like everyone's picking a side?
Look closer at those Democrat and Republican labels.
Yeah.
You've got different races, religions, rich and poor, city folks versus country folks, all mixed up in there. It's not as simple as it looks from the outside.
So even though things feel super divided, those overlapping identities might actually be keeping things from getting worse, acting like a safety valve.
Could be. Doesn't mean it's not a problem, but it does show that even a super divided society has some built-in resilience. And this isn't just some theoretical thing. It's happening all around us, in the news, in our communities, even in our own lives.